Welcome to this second installment of America with an Accent focused on immigration. Today we will learn why do people immigrate, how can they legally come to the United States, and suggestions on what needs to be reformed in the U.S. immigration law. We will have immigration for as long as we have borders, people, and countries, says Shane Ellison, the legal director of the Immigrant Legal Center, our partner in this series. Introduced in the late 1700s and amended many times, the citizenship law needs an overhaul. Ellison suggests rethinking of visa caps for family-based immigration, modernizing some of employment-based laws, and proposing a form of immigration reform for individuals who have lived in the United States for a very long time in the shadows. Understanding the U.S. immigration, history, and law.
Sophia risks everything to escape human trafficking. We met Sophia when she was 16 years old, just months after she intentionally turned herself in to U.S. Customs to escape sexual abuse and human trafficking. Sophia, from Nicaragua, was neglected by her mother and never knew her biological father, who had abandoned Sophia's mother before she was born. When Sophia was 6 years old, her mother began to date another man and would leave little Sophia alone for weeks at a time with no food, forcing her to beg from her neighbors. When the new boyfriend moved in with the family, the situation got worse. The boyfriend was physically and verbally abusive to Sophia. Her mother refused to acknowledge the problem and protect her daughter. Sophia was so afraid of this man and worn down from the abuse that she could not focus on anything. Her grades in school suffered. The abuse only got worse. The cruelty continued for many years until Sophia decided to leave to the United States for safety. At 16 years old, she became one of many similarly desperate children who would enter the United States as part of a well-documented surge in unaccompanied minors fleeing the violence in Central America. The trip from Nicaragua to the United States is dangerous. Instead of guiding her through the journey to the U.S., the coyotes intended to sell Sophia into human trafficking.
Why do people immigrate?
Well, there are a number of factors, I think. Oftentimes, immigration scholars will talk about some of the push and some of the pull factors that drive immigration. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but certainly here in the United States, some of the push factors of immigrants who are leaving their countries and coming to the United States, there's a broad range of reasons. Sometimes people are fleeing difficult situations. Maybe there's significant poverty, maybe there's significant crime, maybe they feel like there's a lack of freedom or opportunity. It could be a civil war, a conflict, these kinds of things. And these are some of the sort of humanitarian kind of push factors, right, where people are pushing away from their country and seeking a new life in a different country. Certainly there are also other pull factors, so factors that would relate to the United States and why it might be a desirable place to immigrate to. Sometimes folks have family ties. You know, they already have family that live in the United States, so they're seeking to be reunited. It could be for better economic opportunities, professional opportunities, opportunities to grow and develop careers and things like this. Or if we relate it back to some of those earlier push factors I mentioned, it could simply be they need a place of refuge, they need a place of safety. So there's a variety of things that can contribute to why a person may emigrate, leave their country, and immigrate into the United States.
So basically the circumstances may force it, but it may just be the ambition to grow and fulfill a better life somewhere else. In this sense, will immigration ever stop?
Yeah, I suspect that we will have immigration, people leaving their countries and going into new countries for as long as we have people and countries, right?
Right.
As long as we have borders, people will be seeking to cross them. And really that's always been the case, right?
Yeah.
People have been moving from one territory to another for a variety of reasons, whether it's resources or safety. Many of the same reasons that play into people migrating plays into current immigration trends as well. As a nation, we were really founded as a nation of immigrants, right? Many people fleeing perceived religious persecution and seeking religious freedom in the United States, some of the earliest migrants coming to the United States for those reasons. If we break down immigration in terms of waves over the years, if we look at 1820 and 1880, the largest numbers of immigrants coming into the United States were from Northern and Western Europe, and that was kind of the largest portion of immigrants coming into the U.S. From 1880 to 1900, it shifted some to Southern and Eastern European countries, and immigration really coming in at high levels into the United States. Then from 1920 to 1960, largely for legal reasons, because of quotas and things that were enacted, the shift went back towards Western European immigration. And then
right?
if you look from the 1960s to present, the shift has been more towards Latin America and Asia. Among the top immigration countries in the United States right now, Mexico, the Philippines, China, and India. Very high number of immigrants coming from those countries.
From those countries. Immigration, as you said, is not just an American phenomenon, but it's a global thing.
Sure.
Now, who regulates immigration in an international level?
So internationally, there's no immigration regulatory body per se. It happens in individual countries based upon the laws of those individual countries, right? So for example, there are immigration laws in the United States that govern who is allowed to come, who's allowed to enter, what categories of individuals are allowed to enter, and who's allowed to stay, who's allowed to remain, and who would be expelled or deported from the United States. And it's United States immigration law that really makes those determinations for the United States. The United Kingdom has their own set of immigration laws. Germany has their own set of immigration laws, so on and so forth. So each country regulates immigrants coming in and immigrants who are to be expelled from those countries. And so in that sense, it's very national immigration regulation.
How about the United Nations? We talk about refugees, resettlement, immigration at a higher level.
Sure.
The terminology and definitions of immigration, refugee, asylum, and all that, so it's all done in a national level?
So when you're talking about refugees, it's not exclusively national. There is a very strong international component to refugees.
Okay.
So if we go back to the 1951 Refugee Convention, this is after World War II and the world witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. The world community came together and said, hey, we really need to have a way to provide protection for individuals fleeing the kinds of things that produce the Holocaust, right? Like mass, widespread persecution and human rights abuses. And so the nations of the world came together and crafted this Refugee Convention that decided on what the definition of a refugee would be. And many countries around the world then agreed to that convention. And by the way, a convention is just a multilateral treaty. So you have a lot of different countries coming together to enter into a treaty with one another. That's a convention. In 1967, it was revisited, and a number of other nations, including the United States, joined at that point. And then countries around the world were responsible with implementing their obligations under the treaty, and they do that through national laws. So there is, as I said, an international refugee definition, and then each country around the world who signed on to that treaty will implement those obligations under the treaty in their own national laws.
Okay, and since we're talking about the law, I would like to understand a little bit or learn more about the history of the law, immigration law here in the United States. When was it established? You mentioned the first wave or the big wave in the late 19th century. When was the law established?
So that's a big question, and there's not really an easy answer because there are many individual laws that have been passed since the very foundation of the country. The first one beginning in the late 1700s was the first naturalization or citizenship law, and since that time it's been revisited numerous times over the years. But I think if we're talking about immigration and how the law has developed over time, what you can see is that in the first 100 years of US history, immigration was fairly open, right? The doors were pretty much open, and there really wasn't much in the way of restrictions or limitations or exclusions of who could come in and immigrate into the United States. It's not really until the late 1800s that we began to see some restrictions in immigration law. The first round of restrictions came in the late 1800s, I think around 1880, and we saw that there were restrictions for certain classes of people, but again, they were pretty narrow. So I think the original statute said a convict, a lunatic, an idiot, or someone who's likely to become a public charge. This was what the law said. So if you weren't any of those things, right, if you weren't a convict, a lunatic, likely to become a public charge, then you were okay, you were allowed to immigrate. Okay. A few years later, in 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is one of the first instances where we see the United States as a country picking out a people group and saying, these are folks that we don't want to immigrate. And this was a move that was born largely out of fear and misinformation. There was a concern that Chinese workers were taking jobs from Americans. Probably sounds familiar. Some people say that even still today, right? Immigrants taking Americans' jobs. But that was really the fear. And there were fears about a lack of integration. There was widespread discrimination and mistreatment of Chinese immigrants. And so the United States as a country begins to pass these series of laws seeking to bar initially Chinese and then later other Asian people from immigrating into the United States. Mm-hmm. But it's important to note that up until like 1920, still, unless a person was Chinese or fit into one of these specific grounds of exclusion, they were largely allowed to come into the United States.
And when did that Chinese regulation change?
Yeah, if we fast forward a little bit into 1920, you have the various quota acts that come into place that are starting to pick and choose nationalities who can come in. There was a significant amount of favoring that went towards Northern and Western European countries, and that wasn't abolished until the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which is sort of the bedrock of our current law, did away with those nationality quotas that were in place strictly before and opened up immigration on a broader basis. There are still quotas, but they're not strictly based on nationality. They're based more on the number of people applying in certain categories, and this still serves as sort of the bedrock of our current immigration law, and it's following the 1960s that we see much more in the way of Latin American and Asian immigration into the United States.
Okay. How many times has the law been amended?
You know, as a grand total, I don't know the total number of times it's been amended, but it's been many, many times. And sometimes it's been amended in big ways, like with the creation of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Other times it's amended through other laws. One of the last big overhauls of immigration law took place in 1996 through a law called IRA, or abbreviated as IRA. And this was a major restructuring and generally a sort of harshening of immigration laws. This was during the Clinton administration. Many new grounds of deportation, many new grounds of inadmissibility, grounds to keep people out were added. Many more penalties for people who were overstaying visas or who had unlawful entries. The penalties were made a lot more difficult. And in fact, even today, under the current administration's tightening of immigration policy and enforcement, we're seeing many of those laws that were enacted in 1996 and the provisions of that law in 1996 really being used sort of to their fullest extent now under the current administration.
Okay. You mentioned IRA as an abbreviation. Can you tell us what's that?
The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, I believe is what it stands for.
Okay. Now, The reason I would like to understand the history of the law is that I'm an immigrant myself, and at times I do feel myself, especially nowadays, as a concept. Very, I'm used for political gain, political reason, divide and all that. I just wanted to understand, was there a political support for the law when it was established? Was there which party introduced the law, if we have the history of that?
Yeah.
If we do.
Yeah, both parties really have been responsible for putting into place big pieces of immigration law and policy. Because immigration law is a federal issue, almost exclusively a federal issue, as administrations come and go, and as the parties take over Congress from left to right, there are changes in the immigration laws. And not always in the way that someone might expect from a sort of partisan standpoint. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The Refugee Act was passed in 1980 under the Reagan administration. This is the modern foundation of our process for admitting refugees into the United States and granting asylum protections. So this was a Republican administration. There was a big bit of immigration reform, one of the last significant amnesties for individuals who are unlawfully present in the United States was also passed under President Reagan, a Republican. On the other hand, the IRA, the law in 1996 that added a lot of penalties and made things a lot more difficult for many immigrants, that was passed under the Clinton administration.
Yeah.
And so sometimes folks, particularly nowadays, think of immigration restrictions or a liberalization as being kind of a red state, blue state issue, but it's not always been that way. And the parties have sometimes gone back and forth in terms of who is pushing for what immigration policy.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of deportations happen under the previous administration, President Obama's administration, and of course many of those restrictions and crackdowns are becoming even harsher now under President Trump, but really policymakers are sort of in a place where they can make those decisions and decide how it's going to go, and it doesn't have to be a partisan issue. It should be a bipartisan issue.
Exactly. I'd like to talk now about the law per se, and I would like to understand the practical aspect of the law.
Sure.
First of all, if I'm a foreigner, what are the categories that I can live under here in the United States or come over to the United States?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that's really important to say is that it's really key to get access to qualified immigration counsel. Immigration law is very, very complex, and so for a person to really have a full understanding of what options may be available to them under the law, they really need to speak with an attorney who focuses or specializes in immigration law. But very broadly speaking, immigration law, in my mind, I sort of break it down into 4 different buckets, if you will. There's a bucket related to family reunification. So certain categories of family members can receive an immigration benefit if there's a family member with status inside the United States. So for example, United States citizens can file a petition for their spouse or their unmarried minor children who are under the age of 21 and unmarried. Those are called immediate relatives, and a visa is immediately available for folks in that kind of category. Now there are a lot of other complicating factors based on manner of entry and length of stay and these kinds of things, but that's one avenue, right, is this family connection grouping. The other is employment-based immigration. Okay. So certain immigrants who have very high levels of education, who are highly skilled, who are needed for U.S. jobs and these kinds of things, there may be certain employment-based immigration options. If they're very highly accomplished, they may be able to self-petition for themselves. In many other instances, an employer will be filing a petition for the employee to bring them into the United States. Okay. So that's a second bucket. A third one, a very significant area of immigration and immigration regulation is what I would just call generally humanitarian forms of relief. So it could include asylum, it could include refugee protection. It could also include things like temporary protected status, which is a form of status for folks who've come from countries where there have been significant humanitarian disasters, natural disasters, for example. They may get a temporary form of protection. And certain victims of human trafficking or serious crimes may have an option for obtaining status in the United States. abused, abandoned, and neglected immigrant children may have an option as well. So
that's
sort of,
on the third.
Yeah, the third sort of humanitarian
Okay.
bucket. And then the last one, just because it doesn't neatly fit into any of the other buckets, is what I call the diversity program or the visa lottery.
Right.
And that's something that folks can apply for if they're particularly coming from a country that has a low level of immigration. They may be eligible for this lottery.
Okay. Which agency oversees the law?
So there's a lot of federal agencies that are involved in immigration regulation. The biggest is probably the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security is broken up to several subdivisions. There's a benefit granting agency called Citizenship and Immigration Services. There's sort of the police or law enforcement wing of immigration called ICE, and then the folks along the border who protect and administer admissions either at the border or the functional equivalent of the border like airports, and they're called Customs and Border Protection. So this is all part of Homeland Security, but the State Department and the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services are also involved in one way or another with immigration regulation.
You mentioned those are federal agencies. Are those self-supported or those receive funds from the federal budget?
Yeah, so some are fee-based agencies
Okay.
and some are agencies that require appropriations. You can tell which agency is which during a government shutdown,
Okay.
right? Because when the government shuts down because there are no appropriations, those agencies that are fee-funded agencies keep moving along because they don't require appropriations from Congress. So one big agency that is fee-funded is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services.
Okay.
And what I mean by fee-funded is when an immigrant applies for a green card, adjustment of status, a permanent resident status, or when they apply for a work permit, or when they apply for citizenship, they have to pay very significant fees to seek those applications, and those fees are what pay for that agency's work.
How much do you pay for one petition? A green card petition?
Yeah, so a green card petition right now I think is $1,255 just for the green card application itself. Some applications are eligible for a fee waiver, but many are not. And that's because the agency needs that money to operate.
Yeah.
As often happens with these young women, Sophia was sexually abused and assaulted by her guides. Young, vulnerable, and alone, she waited for a chance to escape her abusers, then fled to an immigration checkpoint to seek the protection of U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. Sophia was taken into custody and placed under the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They arranged for her to receive counseling and other services to help her overcome her abusive trauma. Sophia was released into the custody of a relative who then called Immigrant Legal Center. ILC child welfare attorney helped Sophia secure a guardianship order from the county probate court to ensure that her placement with her relative was appropriate. Next, she helped Sophia apply for special immigrant juvenile SIJ status, which is a relief for children who have been abused, abandoned, and/or neglected by their parents. She was granted the SIJ status and is now a lawful permanent resident of the United States.
If you are undocumented
Sure.
and happen to be within the United States of America, and do you have any rights at all as an undocumented immigrant?
Yes, yes. Obviously, the number of rights available to someone who's in the United States unlawfully are not the same as someone who has status. And as one's status becomes more firm, the number of protections and rights a person has grows. But there are certain baseline constitutional rights that everyone, regardless of immigration status, has. So, for example, in deportation proceedings, everyone has a due process right to a fundamentally fair hearing, a constitutional right that includes a fundamentally fair hearing. There are certain rights to counsel guaranteed by the Constitution for a criminal defendant charged with a crime. And so in a criminal setting, they may have a right to appointed counsel if they can't afford it, which is contrasted with a civil immigration proceeding where there is no constitutional right to appointed counsel. And there are Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent, for example, and not speak to law enforcement or answer questions with law enforcement. So those kinds of constitutional rights are broadly applicable. And then other rights will become stronger depending on their individual circumstances. Under the law, there may be additional options for them as well.
You're right when you say that it's complicated.
It is,
You
yeah.
really need some legal advice, and This is my last question. Many times I hear that the system is broken and needs to be fixed. In your opinion, what stands on that road? What is the roadblock? Why isn't the system fixed? Why isn't the law getting fixed?
Well, as I said earlier, the law has not been restructured in a major way in quite a while, right? So I think immigration laws need to stay up to date and current with existing policies and existing exigencies on the ground, the needs, so that it's responsive. Some specific ways I think the immigration law is not working right now. Many of the backlogs that exist for some of the family-based immigration options are really, really lengthy. So for example, sibling petitions of individuals from Mexico, a high immigration country, can pend for many, many, many decades. In fact, in some instances,
decades.
Yes, some calculations have been made that suggest that it could be pending for longer than what the person has to live. Right? Now, if that's a situation that a person is in, then there's effectively no family reunification available in that category, right? And so I think the visa caps need to be rethought and reworked in a way that allows for some reasonable amount of time in which families can reunify. That's just one way. I think a modernizing of some of our employment-based laws so that they can be responsive to the needs of employers is certainly another way that the law can be revisited. And I think in general, something has to be done and some solution needs to be proposed about individuals who've lived in the United States for a very long time in the shadows. So a form of immigration reform that would provide protection to undocumented immigrants so that they can go through background checks, pay fees, whatever the case may be, but get on a pathway to status so that there isn't this underclass of individuals living in the United States, a group of people who are very vulnerable to exploitation. And so that'd be another important piece to immigration reform, in my view.
Okay. Now, Shane, I would like to conclude our conversation with a citation of Martin Luther King. Can you please say that to everyone that is listening?
Sure. Martin Luther King reminded us, even in the midst of a challenging situation where he was fighting for civil rights, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's true. That's certainly what motivates me in my work of representing immigrants and trying to protect their rights under the law.
This was America with an Accent for this week. Next week, we will walk the path to obtaining the green card and becoming a naturalized citizen of the United States of America. I hope to see you again next Monday here on KPAO or online at www.newamericansmedia.com. I am Enkela Vebio.